This is the weekly from RT. Headlining today, Germany's welcoming G7 summit guests and as many as 20,000 police officers deployed too in nearby towns as protesters clash with police ahead of the meeting. Civilians in East Ukraine are caught up in more heavy shelling, where a supposed ceasefire has suffered its worst blow in months. And also in the big stories of the week, we brought you a corruption scandal sees FIFA's re-elected president announce his resignation. We look at the reaction and how the probe's developing. Live from RT's main studios here in Moscow, it's Kevin Owen with you this hour. Thanks very much for choosing us wherever you're watching around the world. First then, at 5 p.m, just gone Moscow time, in southern Germany, a small village is welcoming some of the world's most powerful leaders for the G7 summit. Ahead of getting down to business, the atmosphere's been jovial. US President Barack Obama in particular in a jokey mood.
I must admit that when I first learned that Angela was going to host the G7 in Bavaria, I was hoping that it would fall during Oktoberfest. But then again, there's never a bad day for a beer, and vice versa. I want to thank everybody for this wonderful visit to this beautiful village. I know it's a lot of hard work when I come to town. That was, without question, the best Alphorn performance that I've ever heard. I have to admit that I forgot to bring my lederhosen, but I'm going to see if I can buy some while I'm here.
Well, beyond the summit venue, though, the atmosphere less friendly. Over 20,000 police officers have been deployed to ensure protests don't disrupt the summit. RT's Harry Fear caught up with one group of demonstrators.
It is indeed incredibly high security. It's hard to tell just how many protesters there are here. There are so many disparate groups. There are various routes planned, but we don't know exactly how many there are. At least several hundred. Their messages are anti-G7, they're anti-TTIP, they're anti-NATO, they're anti-global inequality, and they're anti-war. This is just one of protests taking place. As I say, I just want to show you the column here of protesters being escorted by the police. It's a highly managed event. The police, as you can see, well prepared for a riot. At present, there's been no misconduct of any means. But the police budget, or the security budget for this whole G7 summit, it's estimated it will total 200 million euros, a very expensive price ticket for just a few thousand protesters here.
So then, the world leaders have now secluded themselves for talks in a lavish sanctuary nestled in the Bavarian Alps. According to the resort, it's the best place to, quote, just do nothing and dwell in possibility, end quote. Well, there are over 100 rooms to choose from, and guests have a selection of restaurants too, from Thai to Italian. After the talks, the heads of state can soak their worries away in one of the many spas. 2 nights cost over 3,000 euros. The EU Council heads urged the G7 leaders to keep in place sanctions against Russia over Ukraine, but at the same time, Donald Tusk said that the group would like to see Moscow back in the ranks.
All of us would prefer to have Russia around the G7 table, but our group is not only the political or economic group of interest, but first of all, this is a community of values. And that is why Russia is not among us here today.
I spoke about that then to investigative journalist Tony Gosling, who says Western politicians are reviving Cold War rhetoric.
Really take issue with these statements coming out of Tusk, Juncker, and we just heard that one from Cameron about European nations being united against Russia. Look, this is old Cold War talk. It's really driven by the Americans, and it certainly doesn't represent the views of European people or business, which is a bit worrying, isn't it? That you've got all these so-called leaders on a completely different page to most of the 250 million of the public of Europe. So that's one of the things that bothers me most about this, is they do seem to be on another planet.
Well, for all the latest on the G7 talks and the protests around it, follow RT's correspondence on all our platforms and, of course, our website as well, rt.com. More of the big stories of the week. Residential areas in eastern Ukraine, including a market, came under heavy bombardment. According to locals, the shelling was on a scale that's not been seen for months. RT's Ilya Petrenko visited some of the devastated areas.
For the second time in a week, a civilian market in Donetsk is in ruins. People here are trying to take everything back home or anywhere else where it's safe. They're trying to save some of the goods.
Лежали, пока был обстрел. Как раз шли к дому, начался обстрел. Два попадания в дом, или три даже.
Такого очень давно. Были в начале войны, но такого не было, как вот это вот такая страсть была. Вы что?
Здесь есть где прятаться-то?
Ну как прятаться? Вот подвал вниз. Подвал вниз. Давай.
Well, those were scenes from the latest shelling in Donetsk just last Saturday, but there was little rest for the civilians in other regions in East Ukraine earlier. This is what they told us about their plight.
Пришли на ставок, порыбачить с удочками. И мы только пришли, начали разматывать удочки. Произошел минометный обстрел.
Вера, только надеемся, что все будет хорошо. Что нас оставят в покое. Плохие мы такие, оставьте нас в покое, оставьте.
А тут откуда-то не возьми снаряд снова. Я вообще ничего не поняла. Смотрю, я лежу, на меня земля. Я вот это как-то поднялась, я не знаю как еще. Смотрю, Валя лежит, все уже, без дыхания.
Europe's OSCE is on a special monitoring mission in East Ukraine. It's been keeping records of the increase in violence. Indeed, it says the latest escalation is of particular concern.
Ceasefire violations are becoming more frequent as well as more severe. In particular, the reintroduction of Grad rockets and other multiple launch rocket systems is cause for added concern.
The OSCE has been releasing daily reports online about the state of the ceasefire, noting violations by both sides. But Washington, it seems, has shown little interest in those allegedly committed by Kiev's troops. RT's Ganichich brought that very issue up at the State Department briefing and got these responses.
I'm looking at the OSCE daily reports of violations, and here's what they show. In 9 of their reports, it appears that Donetsk and Lugansk forces have violated the ceasefire. In 8 of their reports, it appears that the Ukrainian government has violated the ceasefire. In 9 of the reports, it was not clear who violated that ceasefire. Where do you, and I mean the State Department, get the information that the rebel forces are responsible for the vast majority of violations?
From a variety of sources, including the OSCE.
A simple question. Do you acknowledge that the Ukrainian government too is violating the Minsk agreements?
Well, I think by saying a vast majority are the Russian separatist forces, that would then indicate that a very small minority are on the other side. But let's also remember here...
That is not clear from the OSCE daily reports.
I just told you I would look at them and we can get into a numbers game here and see what numbers you're using and what other experts, including our team, says.
It's a simple yes or no question.
I think I just answered your question.
Do you acknowledge that the Ukrainian government too is violating the Minsk agreements? Yes or no?
We don't do yes or no's here. I think I just answered your question when I said if a large majority is the Russian separatist forces, then there's a very small minority that is on the other side. I think I answered your question. I'm not going to play that game with you.
Well, you did not answer. Yes or no? Did you answer the question?
I'm not going to say yes or no. I'm going to answer the question in the way I think is appropriate, and I just did, and I'm going to move on now.
Which is not answering.
Justin?
Foreign Affairs expert Sergei Trifkovich explained to us why Washington is apparently so reluctant to discuss violations committed by Kiev.
There is simply nothing that the Ukrainians can or will do that will be condemned by the United States. The United States is not acting as an honest broker. The United States is very much a party to this conflict. It has been driving the Ukrainian crisis from the beginning, and it will continue doing so in the future. Kiev's policy is being set in Washington, and Poroshenko is like a cyclist who has to keep turning the pedals. It is indeed very much in the US interest, as well as that of the regime in Kiev, to prepare the ground for the EU summit and to cast Russia as an aggressor. Now, it's another thing whether Merkel and Hollande will go along with it, because I think they have every reason to feel rather fed up with Poroshenko's broken promises and the way in which the Americans have been torpedoing the Minsk II process.
Despite America's commitment to Kiev, some Western states are getting increasingly frustrated with Ukraine's breaching the Minsk agreements. According to Russia's envoy to the UN, you can find out more about that and the deteriorating situation in East Ukraine online from us. Another huge story that continued to take many dramatic twists and turns in the week. Newly re-elected FIFA chief Sepp Blatter surprised the footballing world by announcing he was stepping down.
Je remettrai mon mandat à disposition.
I will call an extraordinary Congress. It's going to be held as soon as possible, and a new president will be elected to take over from me.
The football world had mixed reactions to that. European football boss Michel Platini said Blatter's decision had been a difficult but courageous one. There was relief from the chairman of Sweden's Football Association. Some are not so upbeat about Blatter's resignation, though. For instance, German footballing legend Franz Beckenbauer said the pressure on Blatter was so high that he would have had no peace if he'd have stayed. Well, Sepp Blatter's departure from FIFA came amid that ongoing huge corruption scandal. A former executive of the organisation turned whistleblower has alleged that several championships were awarded unlawfully. And US investigators and Swiss authorities now looking into the bidding process for the upcoming World Cups in Russia and Qatar. Some high-profile calls to rerun the bids are coming from the UK.
If you've read all the journalism around it, you'd certainly have doubts about the Qatar World Cup. If that is shown to be true and they can demonstrate that there was corruption, then of course it should be rebid.
Meanwhile, the UK Sport and Culture Secretary has announced England is ready to host the global football tournament in 2022 if it is stripped from Qatar. The proposal was backed by the Mayor of London too, said the capital stands ready to host the championships if it turns out that the bidding process had been corrupt. Geopolitical analyst Eric Drakes had told us the probe is politicising the beautiful game.
I think the timing of all of this is certainly more than coincidental and more than convenient. It is really, I think, indicative of what the larger political strategy is here, not only to oust Sepp Blatter. Primary is to be able to use this as a convenient political weapon against Moscow, because, of course, Moscow has presented a very significant obstacle to the Western agenda in Ukraine, to the Western economic agenda in Europe, broadly speaking. It's not purely a political issue. It's also an economic and a financial one that is quite significant for a country like Russia and for Qatar as well. But of course, I think Qatar is much more assured in their position because of their cozy relationship with London and with Washington.
Coming up, America's mainstream media is hailing what it calls a victory against mass surveillance after Congress failed to extend the so-called Patriot Act. But it's already been replaced with a new law allowing the NSA to keep on spying on phone calls. We'll talk about that after this quick break.
We were tired of trying to do what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so there was a pullout. We were tired of these big interventions, so we did a small intervention in Libya. And the result is now that we have chaos in Iraq, chaos in Libya, and you know what? We're going to have chaos in Afghanistan. It's already growing.
That rationale was also used by the Obama administration in introducing sanctions against Putin's inner circle. Now, I heard you say on a number of occasions that a specific characteristic of Putin is personal loyalty. Is attacking his friends going to make him more cooperative? Because I think that was the logic of the White House.
The idea probably was to have them come to Putin and say that these sanctions hurt us, so could we change policy? I think it has not worked that way.